Chapter 4 Topics. Revisits Europe. Blarney Castle. St. Patrick's Cathedral. Tom Moore's birthplace. The cabman's criticism. Lord Houghton's story. General Grant's reception in London. Elected honorary member of the Cobden Club. Visits the home of his ancestry. Arrives in Paris. Attends the funeral of theirs. Talk Gambetta. Louis Blanc's account of his visit to Louis Napoleon when a prisoner of Ham, and of the loss and recovery of his voice in London. The story of General Cavaignac's brother and mother. Tilden's exposure in recrossing the Channel. Returns to the United States. The Indian Corn Speech. During the spring of 1877 Mr. Tilden began to feel serious concern about his health. The continued strain to which his energies had been subjected for 5 or 6 years, and especially during the preceding 6 or 8 months, had told severely upon his constitution. Arthritic symptoms had begun to manifest themselves to such an extent as to deprive him almost entirely of the use of his left hand, and already slight indications were exhibited of the paralysis agitans, popularly known as numb palsy, which was destined to afflict him increasingly for the remainder of his days. His medical advisers counseled abstinence from all serious cares, with rest and recreation. As it was practically impossible to secure either of these advantages in his own country, after much deliberation he decided to try the efficacy of a sea voyage and a few months' sojourn in Europe. We sailed in the steamer Scythia on Wednesday, the 18th of July, landed at Queenstown on the morning of the 27th, and slept that night at the Imperial Hotel in Cork, but not until we had visited the castle and groves of Blarney. The following day we left for Killarney. On our way we passed near to what, for Ireland, was something of a mountain, the top of which a young Scotchman, riding in the same car with us, quoted the following lines which he said were current in his country: "On Tinto's top there is a mist, and in that mist there is a kist, and in that kist there is a drap, and everyone must taste of that." Tinto was the name of a mountain, kist, of a chest, drap, a tear drop, a sorrow. The moral that we extracted from these lines, in which Tilden might have found some consolation, was that there is no position in this world so exalted as to be exempt from tribulation and sorrow, and the higher the elevation the greater was apt to be the tribulation. We reached Killarney about noon. After lunch we started for Dunlow Gap and the lakes. As we approached the gap we were obliged to do homage to a saucy creature who claimed to be a granddaughter of the famous Kate Kearney, whose charms were sung so sweetly by Tom Moore. Whatever had been the charms of the original Kate, it was very clear that none of them had descended to the granddaughter. Our carriage was equipped with a guide, whom they called a bugler. Soon after entering the pass he got down and played 2 or 3 airs to awaken the echoes in which Moore found the presage in the answering future of his own enduring fame. 'Twas one of those dreams that by music are brought, like a bright summer haze, o'er the poet's warm thought. He listened, while high o'er the eagle's rude nest, the lingering sounds on their way loved to rest, and the echoes sung back from their full mountain choir, as if loath to let song so enchanting expire. Oh, forgive, if, while listening to music whose breath seemed to circle his name with a charm against death, he should feel proud spirit within him proclaim, "Even so shalt thou live in the echoes of fame." Even so, though they Emery should now die away, 'twill be caught up again in some happier day, and the hearts and the voices of Erin prolong, through the answering future, thy name and thy song. It was a while passing through the pass of Dunlow that our attention was directed to a lake about 150 yards long, into which, we were assured by our bugler, as I suppose thousands had been assured before, St. Patrick had drowned all the snakes in Ireland, and did his work so thoroughly, that divil a snake had been seen in the country since. We were left to infer that the water snake had not been evolved in St. Patrick's time, for there is no tradition, I believe, of a water snake being drowned. We passed 2 other points which Moore's verse has made familiar and famous. One was, the meeting of the waters, where for 100 feet or so the water falls from one lake into another, through a narrow channel beautifully shaded, and deep enough to admit of the passage of a large boat. The other was, the fairy Isle of Innisfallen. We arrived in Dublin in the afternoon of Monday, the 30th of July. On the following morning we sallied forth at an early hour to see what we could of the metropolis of Ireland in a single day, for social engagements, already contracted by telegraph, required us to set our faces towards London the day following. Our first visit, of course, was to St. Patrick's Cathedral, which proved in some sense a disappointment. We were expecting to see a venerable, medieval pile, eloquent of age and historic suggestion. Instead of which we found, it is true, a fine structure, but to all appearance it might have been finished the day before we visited. The stones were freshly cut. To our expressions of surprise at its modern appearance, the verger informed us that the cathedral had been entirely renovated recently by Guinness, the world-renowned brewer of Dublin. At an expense to him, personally, of over £150,000. He had left scarcely a trace, inside or out, to remind one of the church commenced A.D. 1190, in which Dr. Swift used to preach his dearly beloved Roger. Even the places in which the mortal remains of the Dean and Stella reposed, had succumbed to the fiend of renovation. The verger pointed to the place where he said their remains were laid, but it is possible that to the next visitor he named some other place. There was no mark or sign to limit his choice. A stone pavement covered the entire floor of the cathedral, bearing no record whatever of anything that lay beneath it. When asked how this came about, the verger said, with a shrug of the shoulders, "Oh, great folks will have their own way." No marks were allowed anywhere on the floor to show where people have been buried. Upon the walls, but so high that the inscriptions were scarcely legible, were cenotaphs to Swift and Stella placed side by side. While the verger was enlarging to us upon the extent of the renovations, Tilden remarked to me, "It is the old story of the jackknife, it has had 2 new blades and 3 new handles, but it is the same old jackknife." From the cathedral we drove to number 12 Angier Street, nearby, the birthplace of Tom Moore. It was a plain, 3-story brick building. As we descended from our carriage a young man, apparently about 30 years of age, came to the door and said, with a smile, "I suppose you would like to look at the chamber in which Tom Moore was born." We gave him to understand that such was our errand. We saw at once that we were about to enter a drinking saloon, or what is more commonly and fitly denominated a gin mill. In the course of our visit we learned from our cicerone that such was the business which had been carried on there by Moore's father, and that such was the business which had been carried on there ever since. The young man conducted us through the front room, which was disorderly and dirty, into and through a middle room, to which there was an entrance from a side street or alley. This room was divided by partitions into stalls like a stable, so that a person could approach the bar, and get what he or she could pay for, in comparative privacy. There were 2 or 3 haggish-looking women availing themselves of the privileges of these pens as we passed. They were converged with rags, filthy, and in the last stages of brutal degradation. We were then conducted upstairs and into the front room or the 3rd story, where we were told the poet was born, and thence to the attic, where he began his career as a writer. It was a low, dark room about 11 by 14 feet in size, with 1 window. There was no part of the house, save the front rooms in the 2nd and 3rd storied, that was not reeking with dirt and suspicious odors. The proprietor was neatly enough dressed, which made the filth, confusion, and disorder around him seem to us the more surprising. We did not ask him for an explanation, but I incline to suspect that it was not to be found in mere carelessness or indifference to order and neatness. Would not neatness and order have affected his patrons unfavorably, and driven them to places more in harmony with their own condition? Outwardly the house looked well and was in good condition, but inwardly it seemed to be full of dead men's bones. We could with difficulty realize that a poet of Moore's genius and refinement could have reared in such a hell as this. And yet, was not the poet's career a more or less logical sequence of his youthful environment? He was not responsible for his father's dram shop, but did he not become the concoctor and dispenser of more subtle and more destructive poisons? Our driver affected not to know where the poet was born, and when mildly rebuked for his ignorance, said that Irish people do not care where Moore was born. English and Americans go to see the house, we Irish never take the trouble." When asked for the cause of this indifference he said, "More never wrote anything for the people. He liked to live with and to please the great people in England. He did not, like Burns, write for his own country people." Manifestly the poet's popularity in England was his real offence in the eyes of Argyll, who probably did not know how to read at all, and if he did, the fact that Moore was as much the national bard of Ireland as Burns was the national bard of Scotland, or Berenger of France, would not in the least have extenuated his crime of trying to please and be popular on the other side of the Channel. Be this as it may, it was very clear that here was one at least of the voices of Erin not disposed to prolong, through the answering future Moore's name and his song. On the front wall of the house, between the first and second story, a piece of white marble was let into the wall, upon which was this inscription: "In this house, on the 28th of May 1778, was born a poet Thomas Moore." Some 2 weeks after our visit in Dublin, Mr. Tilden and I were guests of the late Lord Houghton one evening at the Cosmopolitan Club, in London. While most of the guests were gone to the refreshment room, Houghton sat down by my side on a sofa and made a few inquiries about what we had been doing. I spoke casually of my visit to the birthplace of Tom Moore. He interrupted me, "Let me tell you something." He then went on to say that in the early part of this century one of the most eminent surgeons in Dublin was sent for to come in great haste to attend a young woman who was supposed to be dying. Putting everything aside, he jumped into a cab and hastened to the place, of which the address had been given him. Beside the young woman for whose injuries he had been called stood a young man with the face expressing the greatest anxiety and distress. He was alternately denouncing himself for what had occurred, loudly invoking the divine forgiveness, and begging the doctor to spare no effort or expense to save the young woman's life. The doctor found, upon examination, that though somewhat bruised she was not dangerously injured. After doing what seemed in his judgment to be required, he turned to the young man to know what had occurred, and why he held himself responsible for it. The young man proceeded at once to confide to him the story. In brief, the young woman was an actress, then playing minor parts at one of the Dublin theatres. He became enamored of her, and in a moment of passionate recklessness presumed upon her amiability grant. He pressed his suit so pertinaciously that at last she threatened that if he did not desist she would throw herself out of the window. The very extravagance of her threat rather encouraged than discouraged her admirer, for it never entered his mind that she could be so rash as to execute it, and to threaten it implied to him that she was not more than half in earnest in her resistance. He persisted with his importunities. True to her word, she sprang through the window, and was soon taken up senseless from the pavement. Thus far to the doctor. Lord Houghton went on to say that the young man was so shocked by the immediate consequences of his misconduct, and so impressed by the virtuous firmness of the young girl, that as soon as she was sufficiently recovered to entertain such proposals, he asked her hand in marriage and was accepted. They were shortly after married, and the young woman became Mrs. Tom Moore. I asked Lord Houghton if he considered that story as entirely authentic. He said, "Certainly, the facts are well known to many people still living in Dublin." We afterwards visited the whilom residence of Daniel O'Connell, the birthplace of the Duke of Wellington, and the old Parliament House, the part in which the Commons sat being then occupied as a banking house. The Lord sat in a smaller room, the furniture of which we found substantially unchanged. A remarkably fine bust of Curran in this room specially engaged Mr. Tilden's attention. We left Dublin early on the morning of the 1st of August for England, and after a flying visit to Eton Hall and the Chester Cathedral, pushed on to London, where on the 3rd we found ourselves comfortably installed at the Buckingham Palace Hotel. Here for the succeeding 8 or 10 days we were obliged to devote ourselves pretty constantly to social engagements, most of which had been contracted for us before our arrival. We, of course, embraced the earliest convenient opportunity of waiting upon Mr. Pierrepoint, then our representative at the English court. In the course of our visit he found occasion to give us at some length the history of the measures he took to secure for General Grant a reception in England such as had never before been accorded to any American. He said that he remembered being in London in 1854 or 1855 when ex-President Van Buren was there and Mr. Maclean was minister. Both were invited to a dinner at Lord Clarendon's, then Prime Minister. When Van Buren arrived, Clarendon occupied himself with other guests, overlooking Van Buren, who, when dinner was announced, found himself relegated to the foot of the table. Maclean complained of this in official quarters on the following day, and the reply was, "You give your ex-presidents no official rank, how can we?" Van Buren declined all further invitations. Remembering this incident, Pierpont said that when he received from Grant the letter announcing his intention to visit England, he promptly sought an interview with Lord Derby, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, to ascertain how the ex-president would be received by the English authorities. He received substantially the same reply that was given to the expostulation of Maclean. Pierpont quoted the case of the ex-Emperor Napoleon III, who had then recently come to England without rank or title, but had been received as a member of a royal or imperial family. The like courtesy was extended to his son. Lord Derby said there might be something in that, and asked Pierpont to put his wishes in writing, and meantime promised to confer with some of his colleagues. Pierpont did as requested, and in a day or two waited upon Lord Derby with his program. Derby said there would be no difficulty so far as the cabinet was concerned, but intimated that he might have difficulty in persuading the ambassadors to yield their precedence to a man without any official character or rank. Pierpont invited 3 or 4 of the ambassadors to meet with him to consider the matter. Count Munster, the German ambassador, insisted that he had no right or power, whatever might be his disposition, to yield precedence to General Grant. Pierpont argued the question at length, said that he should yield the precedence himself, and he hoped they would see no impropriety in yielding it to an ex-president. The first state dinner to which Grant was invited in London was given by the Duke of Wellington. Count Munster suggested that Pierpont should make out a plan of the table and arrangement of the guests, which was done. The program was accepted substantially as made, precisely how, he did not make entirely intelligible. He said that he also insisted that Grant should not make any calls except upon the royal family, and at all entertainments should rank next the Prince of Wales, his precedence being conceded, however, as a courtesy, rather than as a right. 2 or 3 days after this conversation with Pierpont, we joined the Right Honourable W. E. Forster at lunch, when Grant's reception became the subject of conversation. He said quite openly, and in the hearing of the whole table, that he did not think Pierpont had accomplished any desirable result by his stand for Grant, that it was a rather undignified strife on the part of an American ex-president who stood in no need of any homage from the English people which would not have been cordially accorded. He also remarked that the Duke of Wellington was not the kind of man at whose table either Grant or Pierpont could afford to strive for precedence. Forster at the time recited a letter which he heard had been received by Pierpont from the Duke, and which ran substantially as follows, that it would gratify him if the greatest general of the United States would give the son of the Duke of Wellington the privilege of entertaining him first at dinner in London. Forster laughed over this as if he thought it the invention of a wag, others regarded it as genuine. I heard the opinion expressed, by some whose opinions were entitled to respect, that the London Times had a great deal more to do with the attentions paid to General Grant than Mr. Pierpont had, a desire to repair some of the unpleasant impressions made in America by the English government during the war being its ruling motive. I presume the honors were easy. Though Mr. Tilden's health had apparently been improved by his voyage and practical release from political cares, he was still condemned to a very regular and almost ascetic life, and compelled to decline all hospitalities which were showered upon him, except such as were tendered by old friends and acquaintances. It was impossible for him to accommodate his hours of eating and rest to those of London society. His admirers in England who were thus deprived of the privileges of meeting him socially testified their respect for him by extending to him promptly upon his arrival the privileges of the Athenaeum and Reform Clubs, for which however, he had little use. The desire to avoid attentions, which it became occasionally difficult to decline, induced Mr. Tilden to leave London for Scotland somewhat precipitately. We reached Edinburgh on the 12th of August. We spent 10 days visiting scenes and places of greatest interest to us in Scotland, returning to London on the 22nd. Among the letters awaiting him at his hotel was one advising him of his election as an honorary member of the Cobden Club, to which he sent the following reply: Buckingham Palace Hotel, August 23, 1877. Dear Sir, on my return from Scotland yesterday I had the honour to receive your favour of the 8th inst. advising me of my election as an honorary member of the Cobden Club. I hasten to assure you that I highly appreciate this courtesy, and that I am most happy to have my name associated in any way with that of the illustrious statesman, the usefulness of whose life it is the worthy purpose of your club to prolong. Yours very respectfully, S. J. Tilden. Honorable Thomas Bailey Potter, Honorary Secretary of the Cobden Club. Volume 2-9. On the 23rd we left for Canterbury, where Mr. Tilden spent a few days making the acquaintance of his kindred, whose names figure conspicuously in most of the parish registers of that county for many centuries. From the beginning the family appeared to have made its career in the army or in the church, and of the descendants of whom he made the acquaintance while here, pretty much all had followed the traditions of the elders. They were all cultivated and refined people with moderate incomes, by enjoying in a high degree the respect and confidence of the community to which they belonged. I am glad to be able to give here extracts from some of the very few letters which Mr. Tilden wrote to his family during his stay in Europe. Never much given to letter writing, the difficulty and discomfort which he already experienced in handling a pen prevented his writing at all to any but his family, and rarely to them. To Mrs. Augusta Pelton, the wife of his nephew, he wrote from Canterbury, August 8, 1877, we came here Friday evening. On Saturday we passed the morning in the Cathedral, which is in many respects the most interesting of any in England. In the afternoon we went out 6 miles to call on a Mrs. Tilden, the widow of the late Vicar of Chilham. She had 2 weeks ago written inviting me to call, and lunch at her house. Her husband was by right the head of the Milstead branch of the family, about which you will read in Burke's Landed Gentry, under that name. By some arrangement of the grandfather, with the consent of the eldest son, the landed estate had gone to the second son by a later marriage, Sir John Maxwell Tilden, a result no doubt induced by the imprudence of the father. Her son of 19 has just entered the artillery as a lieutenant. Her daughter of 21 is the flower of the Tildens here, that is to say, a girl of nice manners, and by much the fairest complexion we have seen. Yesterday in their company we went to Milstead, and saw several members of the family which succeeded to that place, though not living there at present. General William Burton Tilden, who died in the Crimean War, and who was the third brother, left 3 sons. The youngest, now in Oxford University, Richard by name, came to us with his stepmother, the widow of the general. As the place was rented, we met at the residence of the Vicar of Milstead. He is Mr. Houghton, a genial and cultivated person, with a wife and 3 maiden daughters, who, with one of his 4 sons, were at home. And we all sat down to a very nice lunch, visited the manor house and the church, and then went to a neighbouring church at Worms Hill, which was an earlier seat of the same family. A special interest was added to this occasion by the circumstance that Milstead is off from all railroads, and in a purely rural district. We saw the form of English life in the middle class, well-to-do and cultivated, and in the depths of the country. I must break off, for it is growing late, and we start early in the morning for Tenterden. I am conscious that I am writing too hastily to do justice to the picture as it exists in our minds, and as I would paint it to yours. Mr. Tilden returned to London on the 30th of August, and on the 31st left for Lowestoft, on the east coast of England, for the purpose of consulting Dr. Garrett, who had been recommended to him as specially qualified to deal with troubles like those with which he was contending. The following letter was addressed to his sister, Mrs. Pelton, from Lowestoft. Lowestoft, September 3, 1877. Dear Mary, this is a seashore place, on the eastern coast of England, washed by what is called the German Ocean. It is rather a select spot, 10 miles south of the larger town, Yarmouth. The house in which I am is within 200 feet of the water, and my room, a little one in the 4th story, fronts upon the sea. Of course, the fullness of the house has elevated me to such a place. We left Canterbury on the evening of Friday, slept in London, and at 12 the next morning I started for this place, 117 miles from London. Mr. Bigelow went the same afternoon to see some friends in Surrey, and is expected here this evening, for it is now 6 of a rainy day, and I can scarcely see to write. The motive of my coming here is not for the public, but may be mentioned to the family. Dr. Garrett, who is, no doubt, the best man on gout, rheumatism, and the peculiar malady, arthritis, which affects a joint of my first and second fingers of the left hand, whom I had one consultation with in London, has come here for 2 months of recreation, extending to October 1st. It is difficult to see much of him in London, but he consented to see me here, where he is perfectly at leisure. It was a special opportunity for him to learn all possible of my case, and for me to draw from him the results of all the knowledge, reflection, and experience he is capable of applying to it. So I thought at this stage of my journeyings, to discard everything else and come here, and stay as long as I can to contribute to that object. He has a nice family, with whom I have become quite well acquainted. He appears to take a special and personal interest in me, and I have come to a clear conclusion that he has more knowledge, experience, reflection, and judgment on such cases, very far more, than any man I have known. As I have the opinion that the malady, though specially affecting only 2 small joints, is, in all probability, the result of a general cause, and the improvement would affect the general health, and the deterioration would be likely to touch other joints and probably many, besides injuring the general constitution. If I can get real benefit from this gentleman, it is the most important thing that concerns me, altogether out of the dimensions of mere ordinary travel. So I have thought it best to come here now, and stay as long as seems useful, and then go on my way, returning to London early October, say a week or 10 days before I sail, to take a final observation of the condition of things. This statement is very long, and seems tedious, but perhaps you may like to know all about the matter. My general health is improving all the time. I can take more exercise, and am growing stronger. The tendency is for the physical discomforts which attend such a malady, and which, between us, I don't say that except a very few, rob existence of almost every recreation and capacity of a pleasurable nature, to diminish slowly, by irregular steps, in which you sometimes doubt all real improvement, but which yet, measure at intervals, show some decided progress. The opinion has been growing upon me that I shall find it expedient to keep from everything which interferes, and to continue the process for a year or more. I must remember that is now but 2 months since I began the measures which looked to bettering my condition at Sea Girt. Resuming my letter this morning, September 4th, I have crowded the rest of the topic on the last sheet and begin anew. I gave, in a letter to Augusta, I think, some account, hurried and imperfect, of our visit to Milstead, and of the people we saw there. I intended to make a better sketch, but it is not easy to return to a topic once past, or to turn from what follows it in the current of events. On Wednesday, I believe it was, we made an excursion to Tenterden, Mr. Bigelow, Mrs. Tilden, and her son, the young lieutenant of the artillery. The young lady was detained at home by some visitors. Passing from Canterbury to Ashford, some 16 miles, by rail, we took a landau at the latter place for Tenterden. Our ride was through a beautiful country, perfectly rural, and having in it all the elements of picturesque loveliness. The fields, as you know, are generally separated by hedges, the moisture of the climate preserves and renews the verdure, and the cloudy film that nearly always veils the sun, and softens the light, lends an aspect to nature like that you will see in twilights under our skies or objects under shadow. We stopped at the White Lion, a quaint old tavern. That would at once pull down our country as being a century or 2 behind the times, but which was interesting as a relic of the past. We visited the church and its yard before lunch. Mr. Bigelow reclined upon the grass and read, while the rest of us ascended the narrow, spiral, stone staircase of the steeple. I will here record that the platform is reached at 122 feet by 140 steps. From it, the view on every side was fine. The town is antique, mostly in one street, the houses of brick and the roofs of tiles, with everywhere an appearance of age. It is in a sequestered, agricultural region, not much invaded by modern inventions. By the aid of the ordnance map, which is on a very large scale, 24 inches to the mile, I was able to select the place most worthy of being looked at, and went to see a large and ancient farmhouse close to what is called on the map Tilden's Gill. That is a depression on which water runs, except when the period is dry. It is wooded in a narrow strip. The farm is called the Belgar Farm, and was sold in 1873 or 4. It contains about 140 acres. The portions of the land sold are described in the advertisement and conveyances as Tilden's Gill, and embrace the most opulent part of the area called by that name. The farmhouse also seems to have a geographical relation to the Gill, to make it more probable than any other place that it was residence of the man from whom the Gill took its designation. The house is a large and old structure, of an apparent age corresponding with this theory. It is of brick, or mainly so, with some accessories of plaster. My recollection is that the will of Nathaniel Tilden in 1641, an extract from which is found in Dean's History of Scituate, speaks of the house as stone, but it said that brick houses are sometimes in the local usage spoken of as stone, and that there are, strictly speaking, no stone houses, that material not being used. In the main room of the house, in which we were most of the time, the beams stood out from the ceiling and were numerous and unkissed, and at the large windows were propped by an iron standard. A part of the house was neat and comfortable, while some was used for inferior purposes. There is a nice garden and flowers, and a pear tree trained against one of the walls, large, full of fruit, and vines were abundant. The house is quite a distance from the public road, being reached by a lane. The occupant is Thomas Cavaignac, who is recently upon the place, a respectable, middle-aged farmer. He had quite a hunt for a map on which the names of the tracts composing the farm were expected to be found, and at length discovered the advertisement and the accompanying map for the recent sale of the property. That map he insisted on leaving out and giving me, negating my inquiry whether it might not sometime be found useful to them. I will add that the farm of which I have been writing was bought at the recent sale by F. T. Carey, Esquire, Stanbrook Villa, Gravesend, Kent. On the whole it is probably, but not certain, the house I saw was the house of our family before 1634, or 243 years ago. I must close, for I have scribbled over the last of the 6 sheets to which the varieties if the Canterbury imprints are limited. Much affectionate regards for Willie, Gussie, Laura, yourself, and all. I am truly yours, S. J. Tilden. While at Lowestoft, and on the 5th of September, the news reached us of the death of Marie-Joseph Louis Adolphe Thiers. On the following day we left for London, and the 7th for Paris, where we took rooms at the Westminster Hotel in the Rue de la Paix. Early on the following morning, and while we were breakfasting, my old and valued friend, the late William H. Huntington, called to say that Mr. Smalley, the London representative of the Tribune, was in town and had secured a capacious carriage for the purpose of witnessing the funeral solemnities of the illustrious French statesman of the place St. George, and if it would be agreeable to us, he would be glad to have us join him. Mr. Smalley was good enough to call for us about 11. Our party was fortunate in being promptly recognized by one of the gentlemen who during our Civil War had been, and still continued to be, attached to Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He gave us tickets which entitled us to all the privileges of the diplomatic corps. After the religious ceremonies at the church we resumed our seats in our carriage, and when the cortege began to move were rather surprised to find ourselves placed among the chief mourners, and our carriage next but one to the hearse, where by virtue of our position we became objects of the sympathy of the largest crowd of people I ever saw in one day. For several miles on our journey to Père Lachaise, every window, balcony, roof, pavement, indeed every standing place commanding a view of the procession, was beaming with faces, even the street was solid with people almost up the wheels of our carriage, leaving scant room for the police to walk their patrol. We could not get within 50 feet of the tomb, and of course heard little of the discourses, which were delivered in conversational tones by speakers invisible to any who were more than 20 feet distant. The question whether the mortal remains of the wily old politician belonged to the Republicans or to the McMahon administration was settled by the demonstration we had witnessed. There could be no mistaking the political significance of the vast but orderly, respectful, and sympathetic crowd which lined the way of the dead statesman on his last journey, and which had been gathered without the aid or apparent sympathy of a single government drum or placeman. It was a spontaneous and eloquent admission that in his death France had lost what Paris at least regarded as her most important, if not her most illustrious citizen. On the 12th of September Mr. Tilden and I called upon Mr. Gambetta, with whom I had a slight acquaintance, contracted before he had become one of the controlling forces in French politics. He had been condemned, only the day before our visit, by one of the tribunals, to fine or imprisonment for some act of omission or commission, the nature of which I cannot recall. In reply to our inquiries about it he gave us to understand that there was more politics than law in the judgment, that it gave him the least possible concern, that judicial delays would throw the final decision of the questions at issue over the election, then close at hand, when his parliamentary privileges would protect him from arrest. He took his election for granted, which, as events proved, he was entitled to do. To the question whether the new assembly would meet soon enough to clothe him with parliamentary privileges, he replied that the legislative bodies would meet immediately after the election under a new law, enacted since the organization of the provisional government and for the sole purpose of embarrassing the Republicans, but which seemed destined, he said, to be useful to the Republicans only. In reply to an inquiry of Mr. Tilden, Mr. Gambetta said that the Republican voters in France numbered a little less than 5 million, and their opponents a little less than 2 millions, that the Republicans consisted in large proportion of the ouvriers, or wage-earning class, and of the very large and more intelligent class of people with their pecule or small capital who work on their own account, that is, are not salaried, but to a great extent independent of masters or capitalists. This class he regarded as made up of the most independent voters in France. He described them as patents, or men who had licenses to pursue their respective trades or businesses on their own account. The third quotum were acquisitions, not very numerous, from the other parties. The whole number of registered voters was about 11 millions. The officers of the civil service, exclusive of the army, navy, he estimated at about 300,000, who, until recently had been named by the government. They were now, he said, elected by the cantons, but the necessity of having men for these places possessed of some official experience and cultivation forbade rapid changes, consequently popular influence was not yet much felt by them, though it was gradually penetrating their circle. He thought there were many Democrats among the lower clergy. As our interview was in the editorial rooms of the journal, of which he was editor and proprietor, our conversation naturally drifted toward the press. Among other things he said that the circulation of the newspaper press in France had decupled in 10 years. This extraordinary statement, which there is no reason to suppose exaggerated, is rather an illustration of the restriction and oppression which waited upon the press under the Empire, than of the multiplication of readers, though their numbers, of course, had been steadily on the increase. Mr. Gambetta professed to have no apprehension of the army. He said it was now thoroughly national in its feelings and sympathies, it understood and kept posted on the various political problems of the day, and he was persuaded that it could not be used for mischief. In this respect he said the army now very much changed from what it was under the Empire, it is animated by fresh and more elevated purposes. He exhibited the utmost confidence in the future of the Republic, and made light of the opposition, from whatever source it came. Such was the substance of an interview which lasted about an hour. Gambetta had become quite fleshy, and I was told could not be persuaded to take exercise. It was manifest even then, through riches and honor might be, length of days was not in store for him. On the 17th Louis Blanc was one of our guests at dinner, in the course of which he gave an interesting account of his acquaintance with Louis Napoleon, which, as I have never seen it in print, I am sure I need make no apology for setting down here. He said that in consequence of Louis's attempt to escape from his prison in Boulogne, he was tried, condemned to imprisonment at Ham. On this occasion he was treated not only by the press, but by the senators and peers of France who tried him, with great severity. The vilest epithets and grossest indignities were showered upon him. Louis Blanc, who was then proprietor of a journal in Paris, wrote an article expostulating with his uncharitable colleagues, closing with the remark, in substance, that many of those who now abused the prisoner would, had he been successful, have cheerfully licked his boots. Napoleon, who was allowed every comfort and even luxury at Ham, addressed a letter to Louis Blanc, thanking him for the article, and asking him to come and spend a few days with him at Ham. Louis Blanc wrote in reply that could not associate himself in any way or degree with the august prisoner's schemes of ambition, past or future, but he would come to him with pleasures as to a fellow citizen in trouble. He went accordingly and spent 3 days, shut up with him in the prison, where they had no resource but conversation, which Louis Blanc spoke of as something of a hardship, inasmuch as Napoleon was not fluent of speech. He seemed ever to be seeking the word to express his idea, that did not come. This made conversation with him tedious. Napoleon spoke at great length of his political plans, and while he professed to be a friend of universal suffrage, and ready to do whatever the people of France desired their ruler to do, when asked by Louis Blanc in what direction and to what ends he would use his influence to bend or direct the national will, whether he would strive to give it a democratic or a despotic tendency, Louis Blanc said he could never get from him a reply. He repeatedly tried him on this subject, but always without success. Louis Blanc had been addressing some of his constituents during the afternoon, and he amused us by enumerating some of the points of his speech which had proved most successful. The one he made upon President McMahon, he said, was applauded with frenzy. He told the story of one of the first Napoleon's generals addressing his soldiers on the eve of an election. "Soldiers," he said, "you will vote as you please. You are perfectly free to act according to your convictions, but if any man does not vote this ticket, I will run my saber through him." The story had at least the merit of antiquity, and with the audience he was addressing his version probably did not seriously compromise his credit as an historian. During his exile in London, after the fall of the government in '48, and after he had acquired a tolerable command of the English language, Louis Blanc said he was invited to deliver a lecture for the first time in English. He was to dine that day with Edward Dixon, then editor of the London Athenaeum. The prospect of meeting a distinguished London audience, and attempting to talk to them in what to him was a foreign tongue, made him very nervous, and the more he heard about the audience, the more nervous he became. During the dinner he suddenly lost his voice, and found himself incapable of uttering a word in a tone above a whisper. He was in despair. What was to be done? Who was to do it? There seemed to be but one course to pursue, and that was to tell the truth and dismiss the audience, but it was well known that the audience was to consist of everything most distinguished in London society, where Louis Blanc has become already a great favorite. The more they told him of the audience, the worse he felt and the more feeble became his voice. Finally it was decided that he and Dixon should show themselves on the stage and let the audience see, if they could not hear, that he was unable to speak audibly. They accordingly ascended the stage together. Dixon proceeded to make Louis Blanc's excuses, and, when he had done, Louis Blanc stepped forward to verify his friend's statements. Dixon's remarks had been received with sympathetic applause by the entire audience, but when Louis Blanc appeared, the applause was deafening. When it had subsided sufficiently, he attempted to say a few words, mainly for the purpose of showing his dephonetized condition, when to his utter surprise his voice sounded clearer and louder than ever before a public assembly. He said he was never able to speak more effectively, and went on for 2 whole hours with the slightest inconvenience. Evidently the applause with which he was received cured the nervousness which alone was responsible for his temporary aphony. Of the mode in which the Church influenced the politics of France in those days Louis Blanc told a curious story. The brother of General Cavaignac was a libre penseur, as well as a very intimate friend of Louis Blanc, in whose arms, in fact, he died. He came one day to consult Louis Blanc about what he characterized, properly enough, as a most delicate matter. He said that his mother for the past 2 weeks had been pressing him every day to go to the priest and confess himself. It was no use to tell her, he said, that he did not believe in a priest pardoning sins, that he did not wish to act like a hypocrite by pretending to. These protestations only redoubled her pertinacity and anxiety. She asked if he was willing to embitter her remaining days, not only by refusing her request and the assurance of his salvation, but was intent upon persisting in a course which assured her of his damnation. This, with sobs and weeping and tearing of hair and getting upon the knees to him, had been his daily discipline for more than a fortnight. He begged his friend to tell him what he ought to do. Louis Blanc replied to him that the question he had asked him was one which he must decide for himself, and declined to accept the responsibility of advising him. 2 days later Louis Blanc heard that he had been to the confessional, and the clerical journals immediately after his decease had a general glorification over his conversion and his experiences in the presence of death, especially of the consolation which the Church only could provide, and of which Cavaignac had till then always made light. It is in this way, he said, that the priests retain their power through the women, through the mothers and the sisters of the men, that no man had more often dwelt upon this fact than Cavaignac himself. We left Paris, and returned to London on the 8th of October. In crossing the Channel we found the sea very rough. When about half the way over, a sea struck our steamer with such a violence as to carry away one of the davits and the boat suspended on it, and deluged the deck and Mr. Tilden as well. He was obliged to sit in his wet clothes, not only until we arrived at Dover, but in the cars during the rest of our journey to London, in all more than 4 hours. It was a fearful exposure for a person in his condition, and filled me with alarm. He arrived at his hotel in London chilled through and almost insensible. After a warm bath and some supper he felt somewhat refreshed, about 10:30, however, and immediately after he retired to his bed, he had a chill, which was soon followed by a fever. I sent for Dr. Garrod, who was then in London, and who prescribed for him. He said the lower tips of Mr. Tilden's lungs were congested, and that he must remain in bed for a day or two. For 2 days we were in doubt whether he would be well enough to sail for home in the Scythia, in which we had taken passage for the 12th. Happily, however, he continued to improve, and we were enabled to reach Liverpool in time to sail as had been arranged, arriving in New York on the 25th. On the evening of the 27th Mr. Tilden was serenaded at his residence in Gramercy Park by the Young Men's Democratic Club, whose presence, of course, attracted a crowd. In reply to a few words of welcome from the late Augustus Shell, Mr. Tilden made a short speech which, because of his allusions to our great national staple, came to be known as the Indian Corn Speech. In the course of it he said, "I predict a great increase in the consumption of our corn by Great Britain over 60 million bushels which it reached last year. It is the most natural and spontaneous of our cereal products. Our present crop ought to be 1,500,000,000 bushels against 300 million of wheat. It is but little inferior to wheat in nutritive power. It costs less than 1/2 of the seaboard, and much less than 1/2 on the farm. It can be cooked, by those who consent to learn how, into many delicious forms of human food. Why should not British workmen have cheaper food? Why should not our farmers have a great market? Why should not our carriers have the transportation? Let us remember that commercial exchanges must have some element of mutuality. Whoever obstructs the means of payment obstructs also the facilities of sale. We must relax our barbarous revenue system so as not unnecessarily to retard the natural process of trade. We must no longer legislate against the wants of humanity and the beneficence of God." Applause. He also referred to what he termed the greatest political crime in our history, in impressive terms. In the canvass of 1876 the federal government embarked in the contest with unscrupulous activity. A member of the cabinet was the head of a partisan committee. Agents stood at the doors of the pay offices to exact contributions from official subordinates. The whole office-holding class were made to exhaust their power. Even the army, for the first time, to the disgust of the soldiers and many of the officers, was moved about the country as electioneering instrument. All this was done under the eye of the beneficiary of it, who was making the air vocal with professions of Civil War reform, to be begun after he had himself exhausted all the immoral advantages of civil service abuses. The step from an extreme degree of corrupt abuses in the elections to a subversion of the elective system itself is natural. No sooner was the election over than the whole power of the office-holding class, led by a cabinet minister, was exerted to procure, and did procure, from the state canvassers of 2 states, illegal and fraudulent certificates which were made a pretext for a false count of the electoral votes. To enable these officers to exercise the immoral courage necessary to the parts assigned to them and to relieve them from the timidity which God has implanted in the human bosom as a limit to a criminal audacity, detachments of the army were sent to afford them shelter. The expedients by which the votes of the electors chosen by the people of these two states were rejected, and the votes of the electors having the illegal and fraudulent certificates were counted, and the menaced enforcement of his pretended authority by the army and navy, the terrorism of the business classes, and the kindred measures by which false count was consummated, are known. The magnitude of a political crime must be measured by its natural and necessary consequences. Our great republic has been the only example in the world of a regular and orderly transfer of governmental succession by the elective system. To destroy the habit of traditionary respect for the will of the people, as declared through the electoral forms, and to exhibit our institutions as a failure, is the greatest possible wrong to our own country. The American people will not condone it under any pretext or for any purpose. Young men, in the order of nature, we who have guarded the sacred traditions of our free government will soon leave that work to you. Within the life of most who hear me, our republic will embrace 100 millions of people. Whether its institutions shall be preserved in substance and in spirit, as well as in barren forms, and will continue to be a blessing to the toiling millions here and a good example to mankind, now everywhere seeking a larger share in the management of their own affairs, will depend on you. I avail myself of the occasion to thank you, and to thank all in our state and country who have accorded to me their support, not personal to myself, but for the cause I have represented, and which has embraced the largest and holiest interests of humanity. End of chapter 4.